Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 33. And today we're going to be talking about Stoicism and about a character in particular. Now, this is a podcast about philosophy, among other things, but mostly philosophy. And part of preserving philosophy requires pointing out things that are not philosophy but pretend to be. We have, unfortunately, very tragically learned this lesson in the last couple years as it pertains to science. Nothing damages the reputation of science like frauds coming in and persuading people that they represent science, and then people believe that and then are taken advantage of, and then they blame science. Very unfortunately, XKCD, the online comic strip, has a number of funny points about this, especially as it pertains to science journalists and the way that people will abuse science. Now, philosophy is a little bit more esoteric and a little bit less, intuitively persuasive in the way that science is. It tends to be a little bit less authoritative, in the way it speaks. But still, the potential is there. And this is a problem that philosophers have dealt with all the way back to the classical period of Greece, where philosophers like Socrates would famously engage with sophists like Gorgias or Thrasymachus and Callicles and people of that kind. Now, what were sophists exactly? It might be unfair to call sophists frauds if they were representing themselves as teachers of rhetoric, which many of them were. Gorgias, in particular, was a teacher of rhetoric. He didn't profess necessarily to teach philosophy, but some did. And it was on the philosopher to say, no, what you're teaching is not philosophy. It is another field. And Socrates could, in his very sort of polite, meandering kind of way, actually be quite brutal to these people, in tearing down the tacit notions that they taught anything like justice or what is good in the world, which in his view were the purview of philosophy. And if we are to maintain philosophy and the integrity of philosophy and not fall prey to the struggles of science and the way it has been manipulated and abused in the last, not just the last couple of years, really the last several decades, philosophers need to stand up and point out people who are not philosophers, who are frauds, who are giving philosophy a bad name and using philosophy not for the pursuit of the good and the true and the beautiful, but rather for self-promotion and money and manipulating people. Now, there are a number of candidates, people that philosophers might target in order to defend the thing that they love, namely philosophy. An example would be Vox Day's book, Jordanetics, targeting Jordan Peterson. Now, there are things you can say in defense of Jordan Peterson, because, no matter what you think, I would never agree that Jordan Peterson is all bad. He's got some very good things going for him. However, your view of Jordan Peterson won't be complete if you don't understand the criticisms, if you aren't aware of the criticisms as well. However, I think there is a way better target, a way more appropriate, a more completely indefensible character who is arguably even more public as an advocate for philosophy than Jordan Peterson, at least up there. And that is Ryan Holiday. Now, who is Ryan Holiday? Ryan Holiday is essentially a social media marketing expert. He was a self-described media manipulator back in the late 2000s, early 2010s. He worked on campaigns for Tucker Max and for other big social media campaigns, writing and controlling blog posts and directing traffic in order to generate audiences for a variety of different customers. His real big coming onto the scene of the public eye was the first book he wrote, which was called Trust Me, I'm Lying. Confessions of a Media Manipulator, or something to that effect. And it was, it actually is a very worthwhile book to read. It talks about the media cycle, and you can learn a lot about how media works, much in the way that you would learn a lot about how media works from reading or listening to Andrew Breitbart, who really pioneered an understanding of media cycles back in the early to mid 2000s. But since his coming out of the closet on his media manipulations, he's written a number of books on Stoicism. Now, for full disclosure, I have not read all of them. I haven't even read most of them. I've read like 1.5 of them. I read The Obstacle is the Way, and I started Stillness is Key, and I couldn't get any further with that. It was just terrible. But he's written a bunch of best-selling books on Stoicism. And he is a very public promoter of Stoicism as a philosophy. He runs a number of media profiles on Instagram and Facebook and other social media platforms with names like The Daily Stoic and The Daily Philosopher. So he is identifying himself as a philosopher and a promoter of philosophy. So is he doing philosophy? And of Marcus Aurelius in particular. If you have seen, somewhere on the internet an image, a stone statue image of Marcus Aurelius, maybe with special, color tone shifts and an inspirational quote below it, that tendency originated with Ryan Holiday. And really, that is his marker, and many other people have picked up this and carried it forward. So, he's the Daily Stoic guy. He's the author, a former, he would say, media manipulator turned Stoic. Now, what is interesting is at the in an interview he did with I believe it was Tim Ferriss, he said he discovered Marcus Aurelius back in like late high school or early college. He went to a lecture and was introduced to Marcus Aurelius meditations and the Stoics in general, and began reading them back then, before he got into his media manipulation life. So I had imagined when I first heard of him that, he was a media manipulator. Maybe he felt bad about that and then discovered Stoicism, and then that was his path out of that life that he regretted. But it turns out he was studying Stoicism while he was doing his media manipulation campaigns, which is an interesting thing to bear in mind going forward. But I think it's important to jump right in, because I do eventually want to talk about Stoicism itself and not just Ryan Holiday here. So I'll try to be direct. Ryan Holiday is a hypocrite, which is, they say in the realm of persuasion, there's nothing less persuasive than accusing someone of hypocrisy. But it's still a point to bear in mind if your aim in learning from someone is the life skills and the habits that they are promoting. Pointing out hypocrisy is not just a moral condemnation. It's an empirical matter of, does the things that this person is advocating actually work, if you assume that he does what he says he does. The most obvious and direct one is, Holiday's hero, Marcus Aurelius, never published his own book. Meditations was written for himself. Is that something Ryan Holiday is emulating? No. He has gone the exact opposite route. He's gone for a life of public perception and, publishing and I'm not against, I'm not against publishing books, having, 4 myself, but there is a contrast between the ideals of Aurelius and this private inner life versus the persona of Holiday right there. He is a professional marketer, and the famous question that Plato, or Socrates rather, asked of sophists in general was, is it better to be wise or is it better to appear wise? And the classical sophist answer is, it's actually better to appear wise, just as in the Republic, the sophists like Thrasymachus said, it is better to appear just than it is to be just, because all men desire to be unjust and to get away with it. And Socrates, of course, makes his famous, or Plato, rather, in Socrates' voice, makes the famous argument that no, being just is good in and of itself, and it is, in fact, better to be just than to appear just, even if one had to choose between the two. So the off the bat, someone who emphasizes marketing so profoundly and so powerfully is off the bat sort of aligning themselves more with the classical sophistry position rather than the philosopher's position. But still, maybe that would be just a route to having a broader influence. Maybe that's just his way to bring this good thing to more people. I heard him addressing a criticism once of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. And he said, I think the people, this is Holiday saying this, he said, I think the people who, think this is a sociopathic or a bad book to read have a really naive worldview. That they are rejecting the actual means that are used to acquire power. And I think that says that his response there projects his own worldview out. He definitely sees power as as sort of the necessary system and foundation from which to do other good, without directly addressing the way that power can corrupt the good that you are trying to spread. The needs of power can do this. So, and that might be a whole other podcast to do on the subject of, politics and political power. But it's one that J.R. Tolkien famously, illustrated with his parable of the ring, which interestingly draws from Plato's Ring of Gyges. I'll leave it to the reader who is familiar with Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus to guess which side of that question Stoics tended to fall on. So, but what if the message that he's trying to send is good? Well, the way we would judge whether his message is good or not is whether it works. He is advocating Stoicism, and we'll get into what Stoicism is about later. But on the surface, at least, Stoicism is about having control over not your emotions per se, but your emotional reactions to the situations you find yourself in. It begins by saying, look, there are things in the world that you don't have any control over, and it puts you at a disadvantage, and you just suffer needlessly when you have useless emotional reactions to them. So it begins with habits that help you give control over your emotions. And the question I think you would ask then is, okay, does the most prominent advocate of Stoicism embody emotional control? Now, I think in the case of Ryan Holiday, who, was quite well known by a lot of people for going really hard on the mask mandates. I think there was a rumor he turned in some of his neighbors to the police for not wearing masks or something like that. But he's that kind of person. I don't want to just stand on rumors, though. Instead, I want to read a section of a letter he wrote in public to his father called "Dear Dad, Please Don't Vote for Donald Trump This Time." Quote, "I still think about the joke you made when we walked past Trump Tower in New York when I was a kid. Tacky, you said. A reality show fool. Now that fool has his finger on the nuclear button, which I think he thinks is an actual button." Nice mind reading there. "And I can't understand why you're okay with this. I mean, the guy can't even spell. You demanded better of me in the papers I turned in when I was in middle school. I know you don't like any of it. If you'd had your choice, any other Republican would have been elected but Trump. You're not an extremist, and you've never once said anything as repulsive as what people now seem comfortable saying on TV and social media, and in emails to your son, I might add. 4 years ago, I wrote to you to ask you not to vote for Donald Trump." Side note, he wrote that as a letter to the editor in the New York Times. End aside. "But this time around, that's no longer enough. At some point, just finding it all unpleasant and shaking your head at the tweets while saying or doing nothing more about it is moral complicity. You told me that as a kid, that the bad prevail when good people do nothing." End quote. So, obviously, that's not the full letter, and I will encourage you guys to read both of these letters, which are still up on ryanholiday.net/letter and /Dear Dad Don't Vote Donald Trump. I'm sorry, the New York Observer, not the New York Times. Anyways, I would ask the listener here, is writing public letters essentially, berating and criticizing your father in public, is that a stoic thing to do? Is that a demonstration of emotional continence and control? I mean, first of all, his characterization of Trump is absurd on its face. It's more absurd than anything Trump said while in office. Ryan Holiday totally fell for and believed the Very Fine People hoax. He believed the drinking bleach hoax. I'm not sure if there were any of the Democrat hoaxes pushed forward by the media that Ryan Holiday didn't fall for uncritically. Without thinking. He probably believed the Jussie Smollett thing. I'd have to do more research on that. I'm just guessing. But the Trump derangement syndrome, which is this label people have created to describe the way that certain kinds of people seem to lose all sense of principles. Like, there's no understanding that perhaps someone might vote for a politician based on policy. There's no grasp of that. They think that the supposed character flaws of an individual, which, I leave it to the audience to ask whether anything Trump has done compares to, repeatedly sniffing children in public in the way that Biden does regularly. Is there anything comparable to that? There's a kind of uncriticality and an unphilosophical spirit in the way that he uses emotional rhetoric against his own father in public, which is a peer pressure tactic. Now, I am of the opinion that Ryan Holiday's animus towards Trump might be, I can't read minds, but might be an expression of self-hatred. Because there are a lot of similarities. Both Holiday and Trump are, let's be honest, they are, dishonest people. They exaggerate and use very evocative and attention-getting language to make their points. They are both dishonest marketers and businessmen that betrayed their class, as it were. Ryan Holiday with "Trust Me, I'm Lying," sort of revealing the the nature of media manipulation and making a fair bit of profit on the side while doing so. Nothing wrong with that. Just pointing it out. And Trump, of course, as well. was a business tycoon, was a registered Democrat, donated to Hillary Clinton in the 2012s and those times, but betrayed his elite aristocratic, class when he ran on a populist platform in 2016. So they're both sort of dishonest marketers and class betrayers. Both are skilled speakers. This is a particularly funny one because Ryan Holiday, describes Trump as not being even able to write or speak in complete sentences. Someone who is an expert in persuasion, Scott Adams, identified Trump as a master persuader very early on in the election cycle in 2015. I think the results speak for themselves. Trump is extremely good at grabbing and holding attention, which is what Ryan Holiday specialized in. I think Ryan Holiday would be very bad at his job if he was as a media manipulator himself, someone who specialized in gaining and directing attention online, if he was unable to see that skill in what Trump does. So both are skilled speakers. Thirdly, both of them are students of mindset. Donald Trump studied, I don't remember if it was the Carnegie course. Adams talked a little bit about this. The charismatic instructors on success and internal how self-talk and having a success mindset when he was young. And we'll get a little bit into Ryan Holiday in a little bit, but basically his idea of Stoicism is much more about success mindset than it is about philosophy. Again, more on that later. So they're both students of mindset. And finally, both of them are very skillful manipulators of the news, which sort of ties in with the skilled speaking, but the manipulation of media attention is slightly different than just speaking. You combine those two and you get something that's quite powerful. So that's the Trump derangement syndrome stuff with Ryan Holiday. Again, a very unphilosophical position in my opinion. And it's very effective as far as persuasion and getting other people to believe you. But the sort of unphilosophical mindset continues in much of his other views. As far as I can tell, Ryan Holiday is a very, very standard progressive. Like, not a communist, but a little bit more than just a regular liberal either. Like, he was very strongly in support of the mask mandates, or at least enforcing them. He runs a library, or a bookstore, in his hometown in Texas or wherever, and has hosted drag queen story hours at his library. Now, I'm not sure if he is a true believer in, queer theory and all the stuff that James Lindsay talks about. I imagine he is just kind of going along with these things. Because if he believed in queer theory, that would be truly indemnable. But most of his just basic Democrat platform positions are so predictable that they show no signs of real critical evaluation. And in thinking through and applying philosophy of any kind to come up with maybe better positions than the positions that are the most persuasive and the most the standard positions, I would say. So there's an unphilosophical, almost NPC kind of standardization to his views. And I think that's important when we're talking about someone as representing philosophy to the public. And his books are not much better. At least the two books I read through, at least in part, in the case of Stillness is Key, there's a really identifiable format to how they are written. Each section goes more or less the following way. It opens with a philosopher quote of some sort. 60% of the time, 70% of the time, it's a Marcus Aurelius quote. Not always, a lot of the time. After the philosopher quote, which sort of sets the tone for the section, he'll recount some obscure, but not too obscure, a slightly obscure, but maybe you've heard it before, and it's a point of shared familiarity that makes you feel like you have some intimate shared knowledge, or you're learning something new that other people know. So some semi-obscure anecdote from history. Maybe this is, something with Thomas Edison. Maybe this is some ancient battle or some ancient businessman doing something clever. And he'll point out the counterintuitive nature of what someone did. And then he will point out the success of this counterintuitive approach that the individual took in this obscure historical anecdote. He will then credit Stoicism, or Zen Buddhism, usually Stoicism, for this, both the mindset and the positive outcome, and then he will enjoin the readers to emulate this mindset. So, quote, obscure anecdote, counterintuitive decision, look at the success, Stoicism did that, you should do it too. Repeat that process, 40 to 70 times, and you have a book. Then he'll employ the marketing strategies he learned in manipulating the news and public to promote this book, and you have a bestseller. Now, what's interesting, or not interesting, what's amusing, I suppose, to someone who cares about philosophy is that many of these anecdotes are actually mutually exclusive and contradictory. There's a lot of contradiction and a lot of disagreement between these anecdotes that is left totally unaddressed. The one that stuck out to me is in, I think these might have been across books, but in The Obstacle is the Way, he talks a little bit about Nietzsche and the profundity of appearances. Nietzsche talks about the profundity of the outward appearance and the image. And then later, and I can't remember if this is in the same book or in a separate book, but he talks about Mr. Rogers, and he's going on about how Mr. Rogers talks about what's important is not what's seen, but what's on the inside. What is beneath the surface. And that's just one of many examples of mutual exclusivity to the, sometimes it's good to do this and sometimes it's good to do Y. At the end of the day, there is no worldview. There is no actual perspective. It's just a lot of different examples that can all be, when phrased correctly, credited to Stoicism and then push Stoicism in order to sell books and make money. At the end of the day, Holliday's Stoicism is an infinitely fluid and adaptive set of self-hypnotizing reframes, grounded in profound-sounding quotations divorced entirely from the metaphysical beliefs from which those quotes were derived by their original authors. The books are self-talk and appeal to authority pushed by a disjointed collection of contradictory stories that are basically chosen to appeal to the emotional bias of the reader rather than to the actual points one might make from them. There is no there. There's nothing to take away. There is no philosophy. There's only ex post facto applications of quotes to interesting historical stories. The funniest one I thought was in The Obstacle is the Way, which is about turning challenges into advantages. Holliday, points to two examples of American presidents who were faced with adversity, but managed to turn that into a path, into an advantage. And the two examples he listed were Barack Obama and Abraham Lincoln. what's funny is that we are in an age where we've seen a president faced with probably the most directed and persistent campaign of adversity in American history. It's coming from inside not just the government, but the State Department itself, as well as the media and everything else. And the president managed to create a self-promotion campaign on top of the negative press. There is no better expression of the thing that Ryan Holiday is trying to talk about than Donald Trump. A philosopher would admit this. A philosopher would say, I'm not a fan of this person. I don't like them, but this is an example. And of course, he did not mention that. Holiday is not a philosopher, and you can know this not just from how he writes and the ideas he promotes and the ways that he promotes them and his own, the ability of the author to employ the skills he promotes in his own life and in his self-carriage and so forth, but also in who he spends time with and who he considers to be his mentors. At the top of the list in Ryan Holiday's case are Tim Ferriss and Robert Greene. Tim Ferriss is probably most famous for his book, The 4-Hour Workweek. I actually like Tim Ferriss. I think he's a cool guy. I will have to do a podcast one of these days on the Tim Ferriss Mike Rowe dichotomy and the interesting dichotomy in the approach to work that these two characters have, because there's a lot to say about that. But Tim Ferriss is most famous for being a kind of life hacker and sort of pioneered that whole approach to living, trying to get 80% of the outcome by doing 20% of the work in as many fields in life as he could. And if I ever do that podcast, we'll talk about what the effects of that were for Ferriss himself. But that's one of Holiday's mentors. And the other one, Robert Greene, is a kind of pseudo Machiavellian character, most famous for the 48 Laws of Power and other books. And I say pseudo Machiavellian because Niccolo Machiavelli, the famous Italian writer and political theorist, sort of invented the field of political science, was famous for being a realist, for giving very direct and sometimes brutal honesty on how he thought politics actually worked. And not everything Machiavelli writes is great. He wrote a book, his own version of The Art of War, that has been criticized as just being not good. That's not how war is fought. But with The Prince, which is his more famous work, and his Discourses on Levy or something like that, are considered masterpieces and very influential and knowledgeable, and inform political science and political attitudes even today among politicians. It's an empirically driven book saying, this is actually how things work, and this is what you need to do to maintain or acquire power. And, great, in my opinion, great political thinkers like Vox Day and Curtis Yarvin regularly cite Machiavelli. I don't see anything like that in Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. It has this kind of mystique because it has a tone of that brutal realism that Machiavelli demonstrated. But aside from that feeling of giving the honest, brutal truth about how power really works, the backing is primarily based on anecdotes and not on actual patterns. And you see I have not seen, people like Vox Day or Curtis Yarvin say anything positive, or Taleb for that matter, positive about Robert Greene in the way that they would about Machiavelli. There's a it has the feeling of Machiavelli, but without the actual, substance behind it. So he is, in my opinion, a pseudo-Machiavellian who's kind of cashing in on the honesty that is implied by that kind of brutal realist approach to life, which was common among sophists in the past, like Thrasymachus, who Socrates debated in the Republic. So those kinds of mentors Robert Greene is a good writer. We have to give him credit for that. He is a very good writer, and I'm sure that Ryan Holiday learned a lot from Robert Greene about writing. But at the end of the day, with mentors like that, with his background in media manipulation, with the vapidity of his philosophy and his view of Stoicism, Holiday is still just a marketer and a liar. And ordinarily such people should be ignored and just not engaged with at all. But since he is one of the most prominent philosophers and advocates for philosophy, I think more outspoken criticism might be warranted in defense of philosophy itself. So that's Ryan Holiday in a nutshell. I encourage you to explore him further. Don't take my word for it. It would be unphilosophical to just take my opinion and say, oh, that's that. That's all I need to know about Ryan Holiday. Look into him yourself and maybe come up with your own opinion. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there's something I missed. After all, I only read 1.5 of his books. Maybe there's more to it elsewhere. So, but the exploration of Holiday led me to perhaps a deeper question, which is, what about Stoicism itself? Is Stoicism a good philosophy or not? For those of you who don't know, Stoicism as a school was founded by Zeno of Cittium. Zeno, basically the philosophical lineage was, Socrates was teaching, skepticism and questioning, inquisitorial investigations of what is true through dialogue. His primary student, Plato, founded the academy, but there was another offshoot of Socratic disciples who went on to found the Cynic school. And Zeno ended up studying under the Cynics. And then from, Socratism, by way of cynicism, developed Stoicism. Stoa comes from port. So the Stoics were the guys who hung around the port talking. And the most famous philosophers besides Zeno of the Stoics were, Zeno and Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So we have this one Greek, and then we have 3 Romans. It's a very Roman philosophy. So what is Stoicism exactly? The short answer is that in many ways it's very comparable to Buddhism. It begins with really the subject of suffering and of unnecessary suffering, what Buddhism calls dukkha. If I'm remembering my phrasing correctly, that might be the context of suffering rather than the kind of suffering. But in either case, both Buddhism and Stoicism attempt to approach the problem of suffering by emphasizing detachment. Now, Buddhism does this by way of, contemplative meditation. Stoicism has a kind of similar approach, but they call them mental exercises, and they go through imagining, what if my family was to die tomorrow? What would that be like? And going through and imagining the experience of your house burning down and all your family dying horribly inside. And you go through the experience of that in your head. And you do this maybe regularly. And you go through these negative hypotheticals in your head as a way of, first of all, practicing detachment from those things. Because that really could happen. and now you're mentally prepared for it. But also, on the flip side, you come back from that, hypothetical exploration, and your family is still alive and your house isn't burned down, and you have a ever so slightly more profound appreciation for them. And if you do that every day, so the idea goes, your experience of life is actually going to change for the better. It's just not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. Not a bad therapy strategy at all. So that's their approach. There's suffering in this life, and a good way to deal with that suffering is by practices of detachment. It's the third part of Stoicism that makes it both a philosophy and a bad philosophy. And that is, this approach to the world wasn't originally pragmatic, which is to say, it wasn't grounded in let's see what works at a psychological level and then move from there. It was grounded in a metaphysical belief in the logos, which is a singular creative will, kind of like a god, but not a personality in that way, that guides the universe. As Heraclitus says, the fire steers all things, or was it the lightning? I don't remember. It's the same principle. This logos, this world fire, creates and guides the direction of the world in a more or less mechanistic fashion. And some of the things that follow from this is that everything is more or less fated. And so if everything is more or less fated, acceptance of your fate is the only sane way forward. And also, another point about this is that the Stoics believed that everything is good. As Marcus Aurelius says, everything that happens as it should. And if you observe it carefully, you will find this to be so. Or as others have translated it, everything that happens aright. So, is this a good philosophy or a bad philosophy? Well, in going over this material, I discovered there are, I think, 3 strong arguments against Stoicism. And I'll lay them out in syllogistic fashion, and then we can go from there. So the first argument is the argument from badness. So Stoicism holds that nothing is evil or bad. But bad exists, therefore Stoicism is false. Now, at a very technical, objective level, you can say the Stoics are actually right, that, there is nothing evil or bad from their view of the world. Everything is mechanistically determined, and there's no point in defining what is as bad. Amor fati is kind of an attitude. Love your fate, as Nietzsche would say. But the practice of Stoicism holds that there are certain attitudes or approaches that can be less good, that can be bad. You can imagine that you have some control over things, and this can lead to pathologies. You can act without justice. You can act without virtue. One of the good things to say about Stoicism is that they were strong proponents of virtue ethics. So they acknowledge badness in individuals, and it necessarily implies that other people can act well or badly as well. Our desire to perhaps follow Stoicism comes from a judgment that the Stoics, in other words, external people, not ourselves, but other people, were doing something right or more right than other people who were doing things less right or bad. So subjectively, the desire to avoid unnecessary suffering by pointless attachments implies a belief, at least at the subjective level, that bad exists. And the practice of Stoicism, again, is at odds with the metaphysics. So the fact that bad exists in our subjective experience implies that there's no point in adapting Stoicism, because what's right will be right anyways if we're at the objective level, and if we're at the subjective level, the objective view is not relevant. So I don't know if that made any sense, but I'm sure it can be explicated better further. And it's part of a theme. All three of these arguments sort of point out the tension between the metaphysics of Stoics that undergirds Stoicism and the practice of Stoicism as it is advocated by its adherents. So the second argument is the argument from tension. Stoicism holds that there is one logos, nature, God, creative force, the logic, the reasoning laws of the universe, what have you. And all that happens occurs in accordance with the logos. But we observe tension in the universe. Where does this tension come from? In tension, therefore, there is not only one logos. Therefore, Stoicism is false. Now, obviously, there's a frame you can look, step back, far enough and see all of these competing forces, at within a singular system. So, there's tension between a wolf that is chasing a deer. These are not forces that are working in harmony, at least from the perspective of each individual. But we can step back and say, oh, look, the wolf and the deer are both a part of this singular ecosystem, and the balance requires sometimes the wolf wins and sometimes the deer wins that race, and the wolf starves or the deer gets eaten, and everything kind of progresses harmoniously, and we maintain balance in this singular ecosystem. That is a view that is technically true and also completely unactionable. Is completely unactionable and not even actionable as a mental reframe. Nothing follows from that point in your own visualizations or habits or anything. So insofar as Stoicism might be correct about the logos, which I don't believe it is, because we see conflict at basically every level of existence, and tension at every level of existence. The idea of a singular creative force seems just nonsensical on its face, and seems more likely to have been an idea arrived at ex post facto in order to justify pragmatic mindset tools. So that's the second argument, the argument from tension. And finally, there's the argument from happiness. And this one, I will admit, is a little bit glib sounding until it's a bit more explained. But first, Stoicism holds that happiness is achieved by conformity with the logos. But Stoicism also holds that everything happens in conformity to the logos, including our lives. Therefore, Stoicism is unnecessary for a good life. Now, again, sounds kind of glib, but there is an implication in the approach of Stoicism that the mind and our own attitude towards existence and towards the world is somehow separate from nature, that it is, uncreated by this same logos. If our mind is naturally inclined towards suffering unnecessarily and fighting back against fate, is that aspect of our mind created aright by the logos? Or the other conclusion is that perhaps unhappiness exists in accordance with the logos, and we are created to be unhappy. And would it be unstoic to reject that and to pursue happiness against our own fate? I don't know. I'd say, and perhaps the Stoics have good answers to one or two, or perhaps even to all three of these counter-arguments. I will say that I began studying Stoicism myself around 2007, particularly with a book by William Irving called A Guide to the Good Life. It's an excellent book. It's a very good little book that I recommend highly to other people, as well as, of course, Marcus Aurelius. Every young man seems to have a a moment where he gets attached to the Roman philosopher king. We can talk about that when we talk about Plato, I think. But and eventually in my later 20s, Seneca and Epictetus as well. I haven't read much Zeno, which perhaps I should. And it was very valuable to me early on in my life. I think it changed the way I made decisions in a really good way. But then at a certain point, I sort of left it behind. I didn't reject Stoicism. It just seemed insufficient as a worldview. And this might be because I wasn't sufficiently unhappy. You look at people like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, and these were profoundly suffering individuals. Marcus Aurelius, first of all, running an empire is a challenging and stressful situation. He's a guy under immense stress, and he was also suffered in more precise, acute ways. His wife, Faustina the Younger, was sort of notoriously unfaithful. Now, there is some rumors that a lot of her infidelity was, in fact, rumors created by political opponents. But at least one case is more or less confirmed. Confirmed to the point that there's actually a good chance that Aurelius' son Commodus might not have been his son. Almost certainly not, in fact. Faustina slept with a gladiator and confessed this to Aurelius, and then that led to a very bizarre sort of sexual incidents of Aurelius having his wife then sleep with the gladiator intentionally and then kill the gladiator in the act, have his wife painted with his blood, and then he slept with it. Very, very weird stuff. And Seneca and Epictetus were not in a great place either. One was a slave, and the other was a politician who had to work under and even advise Nero, which is not a fun time. And it feels as if Stoicism is a kind of black pill, not a black pill exactly, a kind of consolation against an existence that is fundamentally unpleasant. And rather than trying to fix one's context, you just say acceptance. Acceptance is the path forward. And you see a little bit with the other profoundly suffering man of our age, Jordan Peterson. You just look at that man's face and you can see the depths of suffering that he has been through and the effect that has on his philosophy. So my own conclusion is that Stoicism has tremendous value. It is a good thing to have, and it's a good set of tools for people to develop as therapy, as self-therapy and self-talk. And it's a much better form of therapy than a lot of therapy that's on offer professionally today. Men would be better off, I think, who are going through hard times. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they just went through a divorce. Men are better off reading, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations or Seneca or Epictetus than they are going to a therapist many times. However, as a philosophy, Stoicism is not a good philosophy. It does not do what philosophy does, which is to ask questions and ask hard questions and ask questions that run the risk of undermining their own worldview. There's a lack of curiosity. At one point, Ryan Holiday was speaking to Tim Ferriss about the different Stoic philosophers and why philosophy professors seem not to like the Stoics. And Holiday's view was that philosophy professors don't like the Stoics because they're so unambiguous, they're so clear There's nowhere to go with them. Seneca just says, this is how it is, and then you live your life, and that's wisdom. That's good stuff. No, that's a therapeutic worldview, and philosophers don't like it because they aren't doing philosophy. They aren't asking hard questions. They begin with a worldview, or actually they begin with a set of habits designed to mitigate pain, and then have created a worldview that explains their habits. And I think if you were to make Stoicism into a serious philosophy, you would be much better off picking it up off of its metaphysical foundation of the Logos and setting it down on, the American philosophical foundation of pragmatism, which is a very unique, epistemology that we might talk about at a future date. But basically it begins with, we don't decide truth by coherence or by correspondence, but rather with what works. We define truth by what works. A very engineer's model to epistemology. So, as a therapy, as a tool set, Stoicism has some very serious advantages and some good things to say about it. As a philosophy, I would say not only is it a bad philosophy, it is in a sense not a philosophy at all, and can actually be better appreciated when it is not thought of as a philosophy. So I think I'll end it there. We're coming up on an hour, so I think that's enough damage for today. I hope you all enjoyed, or if you didn't enjoy, at least got some things to think about and to meditate on, and maybe a springboard for more research and exploration of your own, which is the truly philosophical approach to subjects like this. So anyways, thanks for listening, and take care.